Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Asia and Pacific episodes. Today, our topic of discussion today is Japan's national security strategy from 2013 to 2022 and beyond. We are looking to this subject. My guest for today is Lionel Fatton. Lionel Fatton is an assistant professor of international relations at the Webster University, Geneva. Also research collaborator at the Research Institute for the History of Global Arms Transfer, Meiji University, Tokyo, and adjunct fellow at the Chara University, Beijing. Lionel, after obtaining 2 MA in International Relations at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva and Waseda University in Tokyo, he became a foreign correspondent for Japanese news agency Kyodo News, covering the United Nations in Geneva during 10 years, while simultaneously pursuing a Ph.D. at Sciences Po Paris. He completed the Ph.D. Program in 2015, since then holding a Ph.D. in political science, mentioned international relations. His research interest lies in international relation theories and more precisely neoclassical realism and civil-military relations. His geographical area of specialization is Indo-Pacific region, and particular international and security dynamics in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and also China-Japan relations and Japan security policy. Lionel also the co-author of the Japan's Awakening, Moving Toward an Autonomous Security Policy, published by Fatton in 2019. Welcome, Lionel. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting, Lokman. Pleasure.
Our topic, I think, is quite broad for today. We will cover almost 10 years, I think, today.
Yes, exactly. It's broad, and I will also try to look beyond the forthcoming national security strategy, looking at what we can expect to see in this document and maybe how Japan is trying to adapt to the evolving regional environment.
Okay, let me jump to my question. Why did Japan release a national security strategy in 2013, and why it is important, why it is significant? What will be your take?
Yeah, okay. So first, 2013 was, this period was extremely important for Japan and for the region. We have to remember that the late 2000s, the early 2010s were extremely tense in the region, and a threat to Japanese security started to materialize extremely rapidly. First, with North Korea. This was a period when many countries in the region realized that the six-party talks were important, so they broke down in 2009. Then Obama came to power in the United States, adopted a strategy called strategic patience, which actually had a counterproductive result of, I would say, triggering more and more provocations by North Korea, being missile tests, nuclear tests. So basically, Japan started to realize that the North Korean problem was not really a problem, it was a headache. So Japan had to be more proactive in protecting itself against this threat. And of course, you had the China factor at that time, because in 2013, we are in the midst of what I would call the first wave of Chinese assertiveness, even though there are huge academic debate about whether China was more assertive than before, how to define assertiveness. Being reactive assertiveness or other terms, that's for sure that from the Japanese point of view, the early 2010s saw the materialization of this threat, and especially in the East China Sea, around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, so especially after Japan nationalized 3 of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in September 2012. China started to send more and more vessels in the contentious zone around the islands, which are administered by Japan, established an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea that, of course, covered certain areas similar to Japan's own ADs. The environment was becoming more severe already at that time. And you should add to that the United States' influence in the region was weakening. We are here during the Obama era. But I mean, this is in the aftermath of the financial crisis. There are risks of lockdowns of governmental institutions in the United States. And even with the pivot to Asia policy declared by Obama, I mean, many actors in the region were not that convinced that, I would say, the resources will follow the political discourse. So also an issue of reliability in the US-Japan alliance. And finally, we should not forget that domestically in Japan, this is the beginning of an era of political stability. After a long period of instability after Prime Minister Koizumi retired in 2006, we have had huge political instability, which of course absorbed Japanese leaders inwards, so therefore focus on domestic political issues and therefore less able to adapt their foreign and defense policy to what was happening in the region. With Abe, political stability was re-established, and therefore Japan was more in a better position to, I would say, improve its security policy and defense posture. Why now significant? Well, obviously because this national security strategy, 2013, is the first national security strategy of Japan in the post-Pacific War era. So of course this is relevant. And I guess as we will discuss, it's also relevant because, I mean, the national security strategy reflected a Japan that wanted to be more proactive on the regional scene, also somehow more self-reliant in terms of national defense. And that's why some people will argue that this is the beginning of a process that is leading Japan to be a more, I would say, proactive and muscular player on the regional scene.
So prior to the 2013, the Japan doesn't have any national security strategy, didn't release any?
No, never. This is the first one since its defeat in the Pacific War in 1945.
I see.
Which also, I will say, go with the myth or I would say the characterization of Japan for a long time as an abnormal country, right? Economic superpower, but lacking teeth in terms of national defense or security policy.
So how did Japan's security policy evolve following the release of 2013 national security strategy?
Okay, so first, to talk slightly rapidly about the national security strategy of 2013, there were three objectives in this strategy and three pillars to achieve these objectives. So basically, the three objectives were to guarantee Japanese security, of course, then a cycle that is a bit broader to maintain regional stability in the Asia-Pacific, and even broader to enhance global stability. And here, the concept that was formulated to reflect this objective was the concept of Japan as a proactive contributor to peace. Okay, I will come back to that because I think this concept will start to be diluted in the forthcoming national security strategy. Now, regarding the pillars to achieve the objective, this was all about improving Japanese military capabilities, strengthening the alliance with the United States, the only ally of Japan, and extending cooperation with third countries, meaning countries others than the United States. And since this national security strategy was enacted, so in December 2013, Japan has progressed in the three pillars. Regarding the first, meaning Japanese military capabilities, along with the strategy was released National Defense Program Guidelines, which is usually, always go along security strategies, and we will see it will go also along with the 2022 version. Here in the 2013 version of the National Defense Program Guideline, we see the emergence of a concept that is dynamic joint defense force. It seems, I would say, obvious to have a joint armed forces, but be aware that until very recently, until that point, the three branches of the self-defense forces, the Japanese military, the Navy, ground forces, and air forces, were operating in silos. This is because of historical animosity between these branches. This is because of different bureaucratic orders. But anyway, the point is that they were actually more integrated with their American counterparts than in between themselves. And with this concept, Japan wanted to make the self-defense forces a military that could actually operate more autonomously from the American brothers, if you want. So this was one evolution, which was replaced with in the subsequent National Defense Program guidelines of 2018 by the concept of multi-domain defense force. Here, this is again increasing the jointness between the three branches of the Japanese military, but also pushing toward cross-domain operations, meaning operations that implies not only activities, let's say in the air and the sea, but also across domain like electromagnetic spectrum, cyberspace, also space, and etc. And therefore, based on these two concepts, the Japanese military has acquired certain capabilities that it was denied until that point. So typically, in early 2018, Japan created its first amphibious brigade. So the Japanese version of US Marines, if you want. Until that point, it didn't exist. And here, even though the brigade is actually part of the ground self-defense forces, it of course operates on sea and in the air. Okay, this is the nature of amphibious operations. So here you see also, I would say, the jointness and the cross-domain, I would say, dimension of the self-defense forces emerging. Now, let me turn to the second pillar of the security strategy. So the US-Japan alliance. Here we have seen the development of a stronger alliance with the United States. And with the release of the US-Japan Defense Guidelines in 2015, we have seen the scope of the alliance increase. Until that point, the alliance between Japan and the United States was confined to a region that was close to Japan. Okay. The previous guideline was issued in 1997 and actually provided the ability for the self-defense forces to support American forces only in situations in areas surrounding Japan. And therefore, theoretically, well, legally speaking, the Japanese self-defense forces could not accompany with rare area supports, typically the American troops, let's say, in the Indian Ocean or in some part of Africa. Here, the scope of the alliance is expanded globally. So it becomes a global alliance. And the guidelines also eliminated the separation between peacetime and contingencies, meaning that we have realized, and I will come back to that, that today there is no more clear cut between a peacetime and a wartime. Most of the time, there is a gray zone that is in the middle. Okay, we see Ukraine and Russia today. Are we at war? Are we at peace? Well, it's both of them, right? And therefore, in other words, the alliance has become more flexible. And also, to mention about the alliance with the United States, a key turning point for the bilateral relationship is that in 2014, Japan reinterpreted its own constitution to allow for the right of collective self-defense. Until that point, if the United States was attacked, but Japan was not in a position to help the United States. Since 2014, well, there are a few conditions for Japan to do so, but even if the Japan is not attacked directly, the self-defense forces will be able to help the United States to repel the attack. And third, if I can finish with that, regarding the third country cooperations in the National Security Strategy of 2013. Interestingly, the strategy depicted South Korea as of utmost geopolitical importance for the security of Japan. So it was a priority for Japan in 2013 to cooperate with South Korea, especially, of course, to face North Korea. Now, because of historical issues, political issues between these two countries, this bilateral relationship has not moved forward extensively. They had, a few years after the release of the alliance, the security strategy, they had an agreement on the exchange of military information. But it didn't move beyond that point. I mean, the relationship between these two countries is extremely bad today. Let's see if it continues. But Japan has pushed other dimensions of this third country cooperation, typically with, in terms of the economic dimension of regional dynamics. As you know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was key element of Obama's foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region. Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement, refused to continue to discuss the agreement when he arrived in the White House, and Japan took the lead to keep this agreement alive. That became the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a key aspect of Japanese security policy about creating a framework, an economic framework in the region that would respect certain standards in terms of trade, intellectual property, and etc. Where Japan has become much more active after the first national security strategy is really Southeast Asia, the Quad countries, and Australia. Southeast Asia, Japan has been much more involved in this region. It has, for example, in November 2016, issued the so-called Vietnam Vision, which is the first defense cooperation framework structure for Japan to cooperate with Southeast Asian countries, part of ASEAN. Okay. It has also, during this period, after the release of the security strategy, provided much more assistance to typically coast guards of these countries. Now, some people say it's about offshore balancing vis-a-vis China, because China, as you know, is more and more ambitious in the South China Sea. And this is true that I guess this was the aim of Japan. I mean, making sure that the countries that have territorial disputes with China will be able first to identify the Chinese ships arriving in certain areas, and then to have more muscle to repel them. So this is cooperation with the Philippines, also with Indonesia, with Vietnam, etc. Finally, the Quad, this is a bit more recent, but Japan has been a key actor in the growing institutionalization of the quadrilateral security dialogue, so between India, Australia, the United States, and Japan. And we will come back to that, I guess, because I think it will be central to the new national security strategy. And finally, Australia, which was already considered as a quasi-ally of Japan. And you saw that early this year, so early January, Japan and Australia reached a reciprocal access agreement, which was basically the last piece of military agreement that was lacking for the two countries to really cooperate seamlessly in terms of military operations. So you had this upgrade, Japan, if you want, with this first national security strategy, I will say, create more muscle for itself, but also start to expand beyond the US as the key ally to reach other countries for a growing security architecture that will have Japan as a key player.
So the Lionel, why among this the security map, why is Japan on the verge of releasing a new national security strategy? What is the need for Japan go in this way?
Okay, so first, the first national security strategy had a lifespan of 10 years. So it makes sense. It was December 2013 that Japan starts working on the next one. But the world, and especially this region, the Indo-Pacific, has changed drastically in 10 years. Typically North Korea, well, the sophistication of North Korean missiles has been extremely rapid. Very few people back in 2013 could have bet that North Korea would be testing hypersonic missiles in 2022. North Korea has shown it is now working on hypersonic technology, which make it extremely difficult to intercept missiles. So the traditional missile defense system of Japan is actually becoming more and more important. And you have also the point that North Korea has trained the launch of what we call saturation attacks. So meaning launching several missiles at the same time to saturate the missile defense system of other countries. We will see that Japan is extremely worried about that. And from my point of view, has to have a paradigm shift in its missile defense approach. But then again, the North Korea has become much more powerful today. So a need here to tackle a new level of North Korean threat. Also, I mean, Russia has woke up. We all realize it. Okay, December 2013 is before the Donbass and Crimean interventions. And closer to Japan, we have seen that, I mean, Russia has militarized disputed islands that are still disputed between Russia and Japan, called Northern Territories in Japanese and in Japan, and Southern Kuriles in Russia. So the threat of Russia is extremely close to the island of Hokkaido in northeast Japan. Also, China. I mean, China, even though we could debate whether China was assertive in the early 2010s, I mean, today it's difficult to argue that China is not a country that shows muscles, obviously. I mean, we can drop in the term reactive assertiveness. We can more and more drop the word reactive. And also, what worries Japan to a large extent is the fact that in the meantime, since the issuance of the 2013 security strategy, China has perfected gray zone operations, meaning these operations that are not full-fledged conflict, remain below the threshold of war, but are extremely effective to, I would say, make fait accompli, to have salami slicing tactics, meaning all this maritime militia backed by coast guards, to which a navy will have, because of the rule of engagement, will have difficulties responding or containing, and we have seen that especially in the South China Sea. But of course, as I said, I mean, Japan has a territorial dispute in the East China Sea, so it has to prepare also to that. And finally, what has changed drastically is the US-China relationship, which has deteriorated extensively since the early 2010s, okay? Especially during the Trump era, but I mean, it was a trigger for something that I would say structurally was supposed to happen, meaning like a strategic confrontation between the two. And finally, the COVID. I usually don't like to talk about COVID because I have enough of this story, but I mean, COVID has changed security somehow. I mean, it has accelerated the digitalization of societies. It has highlighted the need to be much more serious on economic security, okay, cyber attacks, and etc. And therefore, this also will be, I would say, integrated in the forthcoming national security strategy.
So, Lionel, what can we expect from the forthcoming national security strategy of Japan?
Okay, so speculative answer, okay. This is an exercise that I'm not that at ease with, but I will try. So, first, I think this national security strategy, which will be more concrete, more specific than the one issued in 2013. What I think is happening is that first, Japan is much more serious about its strategy. Remember, in 2013, the panel responsible to discuss the strategy started working in December, issuing the strategy in September. It started to work in September, issued the strategy in December, only 3 months of work. That's very short to have a national security strategy. Then, of course, the panel used previous security reports, that's for sure, but still. Now, this year, the entities responsible for working on the forthcoming national security strategy started 1 week ago, exactly Wednesday last week. And we expect the national security strategy for the end of the year. So by definition, more time to discuss more topics and to make this security strategy more, I would say, more specific and more concrete. Also, and I think this will be a key change, I'm not saying that the new national security strategy will drop the term proactive contributor to peace, because Japanese politicians like continuity, especially when the Liberal Democratic Party is in power. But this proactive contributor to peace concept will be diluted, because I think Japan now realized that because it is overstretched in terms of resources, economically, but militarily especially, it cannot pretend to be extremely active in enhancing global stability. There should be priorities, and the priorities will be more and more Japan itself, so Japan defense. Then, of course, it implies regional involvement. That's for sure that the regional dimension of the new strategy will be important. But still, I think we will have a refocus on Japan and its immediate region in this national security strategy, because simply, I mean, the threats are coming closer and closer. Now, I think Japan will keep the 3 pillars I mentioned. So meaning improving Japanese military capabilities, strengthening the US alliance, and working with third countries. Here, I think in the first pillar, regarding Japanese military capabilities, we may see actually more emphasis on the Japanese Coast Guard. I mentioned about the gray zone operations of China. Japan should take seriously the Coast Guard as, if not the fourth branch of the self-defense forces, because it is not a military institution, but take seriously this Coast Guard as a key element to face these gray zone operations by China. And I suspect that the national security strategy that is forthcoming will reflect this growing importance of Coast Guards, okay, even though, of course, the Coast Guards are a non-military institution. Also, this security strategy will more and more put focus on new domains of warfare, especially space, electromagnetic spectrum, and cyber. Okay, so this has started already in all major military powers of the world, but I think here we will have a qualitative leap in these domains, and I will tend to think, especially the cyber. Space we will see with the Americans, it will be interesting, but especially in the cybers, because to be honest, if today one of the main threats to Japan is North Korea, very few people in the highest cycle of decision making in Tokyo really believe that North Korea could fire a nuclear weapon on Japan tomorrow. North Korean cyber attacks are much more dangerous and much more likely. Okay, that's like gray rhino. I mean, Lazarus is a North Korean affiliated group. It's extremely powerful. And I mean, look at the urbanization of Japan. It's hugely urbanized. All the financial and economic activities of Japan are concentrated in a few regions. And if you take the Kanto area around Tokyo, but I mean, this mega city is alimented by electricity coming from different power plants, but especially that. Well, if you want to really hurt Japan, you basically launch a cyber attack on dams and blackout in Tokyo, financial, the Nikkei force, and etc. I mean, this is much more likely than a nuclear type missile arriving on Japan. So I guess here you will have much more seriousness on cyber security. And as I said, because of COVID, much more focus on economic security in this national security strategy. Therefore, if you want, the definition of security for Japan, it will broaden. And we have seen Kishida, the current prime minister, has started working on economic security extremely seriously, because he has created an economic security council and the position of economic security minister. So this will certainly be reflected in the forthcoming national security strategy. Regarding the alliance with the US, here it will be taken, from my point of view, to the next phase. But that's an opportunity for Japan, because I mean, Biden is, I would say, a classic politician. He understands the value of the US-Japan alliance. And here I think the new security strategy will put flesh on all bones, if I can say, typically rare area supports that is here a long time that Japanese troops provide to American troops. I think here we will have something that will be more robust in terms of rare area support. And we will see also the emergence or the deepening in new domains of warfare. And here, keep a watch on space, I think, because the two countries, I guess, will start to work much more seriously on typically small satellite constellation systems, which are starting to be extremely important to track low altitude missiles, hypersonic gliding vehicles, hypersonic cruise missiles. So this is an agenda that will be centered. And if I can talk about the third country, cooperation will be interesting also. I think it will become more concrete in terms of both areas of priority and partners. Areas of priorities, from my point of view in the region, will be Southeast Asia. It's not new. It was the case in the 2013 strategy, but also South Pacific. I will come back to that, because from my point of view, South Pacific will become...
Introducing Wisdom.
Regarding the partners, the usual suspects, as usual, the Quad countries. Okay, so India, Australia, the United States. UK and France more and more. UK, after Brexit, is presenting itself as global Britain, so will be more involved in the Indo-Pacific. Japan will benefit from that if they can coordinate their operation, for example, in the South China Sea. And France, because it's a Pacific nation. Okay? It has New Caledonia, other territories, it has troops in the Pacific. Now, just to finish with the South Pacific, because this is something that is not mentioned enough. I think it will find a good place in the forthcoming strategy, because I mean, we see that this region will become the center of the chessboard between China and the United States. Because we have a line of confrontation stretching from east to west, or the other way around, by the way, with China trying to increase its influence in West and South Pacific, pushing the United States eastward. The United States, of course, tried to remain anchored in the region and, of course, to defend its interest. And I think here Japan and Australia and France are starting to recognize that they have to work to reduce the Chinese influence in the region much more aggressively. And therefore, I anticipate a line of cooperation that will go from the north to the south, from Tokyo to Canberra with the help of France, which will actually work much more closely and more decisively to make sure that actually the United States is able to remain anchored in the Western Pacific. Because for Japan, the worst case scenario is that the Chinese influence extends beyond the first island chain to the West Pacific, and the United States is more and more denied access to the region. If the US is denied access to the region, and Japan is more and more isolated. And Japan has started, by the way, doing so because in September last year, it held with Pacific Island nations the first Japan-Pacific Islands defense dialogue. So you see that Japan, of course, had economic cooperation with these countries before, but here you have a military dimension that is arriving very rapidly. And I think it resonates also in Australia, these kind of initiatives.
Lionel, I think you told a lot of things, but again, I'm going to ask about the national security strategy. Is there anything unknowns related to this national security, unknowns aspects? Do you have any words?
Yeah, there are many. As I said, the answers to your previous questions were speculative. There are many. First, I mentioned about the economic security dimension, which I think will be prominent in the next strategy. Now, how exactly it will be reflected on paper will also depend on the Americans, because the Biden administration is working on the US Indo-Pacific economic framework, right? That we are waiting for release. Let's see what the nature of this framework looks like, because it will fit Japanese approach to economic security. So we have to wait and see for these documents and for this framework to come out. Also, in Asia, this is election year in two key countries. South Korea first. So in March, we have elections. As I said, in 2013, in the strategy 2013, South Korea was of utmost geopolitical importance for Japan. Because of the tensions, of course, the bilateral relationship have not progressed that much since then. Now, let's see what is the outcome of the next election. If we have one leader in Seoul that is serious in trying to mend ties with Japan, South Korea could actually stay a partner of choice in the forthcoming national security strategy. We don't know. To be honest, I'm not optimistic. But I mean, it will depend on the outcome of this election. And also, I mean, South Korea is important for Japan vis-a-vis North Korea, of course, but also vis-a-vis China. So far, really, South Korea has tried to maintain an equilibrium between China and the United States. So economic incentives, security incentives. Well, it seems, looking at the presidential candidates' speeches in recent weeks and months, that both tend to take a more stringent position vis-a-vis China, stronger and less, I would say naive maybe. And therefore, this is also something that Japan will look carefully at before actually deciding of the position of South Korea in the strategy. A second election that we have to pay close attention to, and that is not mentioned enough, I think, is the Philippines. The Philippines is central in this region. It is in between the South China Sea and the East China Sea. It is a treaty ally of the United States, but as you all know, under Duterte, it has pivoted to China, then it has repivoted to a middle ground with often conflicting messaging coming out of Manila, being the defense secretary or Duterte himself. Well, the Philippines has been pretty unstable for a few years. Now you have an election. If the outcome of this election is the election of somebody who is more pro-American, more opposed to China, especially regarding the territorial dispute in the South China Sea, well, this is a partner of choice for Japan. It makes sense. I mean, if you look at a map, geostrategically speaking, for Japan, the United States, I will tend to think that the Philippines is even more important than Taiwan. We can disagree with that, but this is really a country that is underestimated in terms of geostrategy in this region. And therefore, if this country, after the election, has a pivot back to the United States, Japan will jump. You can be sure of that. And therefore, the Philippines will be extremely high in the strategy. Finally, the last two unknowns that I have is how Japan will depict its objective in its bilateral relationship with China. In 2013, Japan was seeking to maintain mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interest. Will it keep that wording or not? I don't know. I think common strategic interest doesn't fit the reality today. Mutually beneficial relationship, I'm quite sure it will be kept, but still, the wording will be key. The devil is in the details, as you know. Will be key to see how Japan positions itself in this bilateral relationship today. So this is an unknown. The last unknown is clearly Taiwan. Okay, so Japan, since Biden is in the White House, has repeated many times, also in a joint statement with the United States, with American officials, its desire to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So we can expect peace and stability in Taiwan Strait to be reflected in strategy, but will it be developed? Or will it just be a copy-paste of a joint statement between Biden and Suga, for example? I don't know. Here, these are details that we will have to pay attention to.
So how we can explain the Japan's involvement to the Taiwan Strait dynamics? Is it really the Taiwan is a national security matter for Japan?
I think there are three elements here. First, the Chinese activities, military activities, and also diplomatic pressure on Taiwan have increased drastically in recent years. Okay, we've seen with air exercises and etc. And I think, Japan is not naive. Japanese leaders are not naive. They know for decades that a contingency in Taiwan Strait and war will at least indirectly impact Japan. If you look where Yonaguni, the southwesternmost islands of Japan, is located, it's so close to Taiwan that by definition, you will have an indirect impact on Japan. But the fact that China has been extremely more and more assertive towards Taiwan, and also because I would say the narrative coming out of Beijing regarding reunification and etc. I think this has been a wake-up call for Japan, saying, well, what we knew would certainly happen someday could happen before than we thought. Okay, and I think there was also a wake-up call in the United States, and therefore this led Japan to somehow think more about its positioning vis-à-vis Taiwan. Second is that Taiwan has become more important for Japan today, especially after COVID. Well, we are not out of COVID, but let's say since the COVID pandemic started, because of, again, the focus of Japan on economic security, supply chain resilience. Japan is a high-tech country. It needs semiconductor chips. Well, Taiwan is the key for the chips, computer chips. And therefore, Japan has understood that it has to maintain a very strong economic relationship with Taiwan. And usually, when you want an economic relationship with a country, especially a country that is looking for diplomatic recognition, you need also to provide some political incentives somehow. So there is a rapprochement. And finally, many Japanese politicians who have been friendly vis-à-vis Taiwan were in government, were definitely, by definition, because in government, restrained in their ability to talk, now are out of the government, but still very influential. So they have a margin of maneuver that is much wider in talking about what they want to do vis-à-vis Taiwan. The best example is Shinzo Abe. Shinzo Abe being out of office, is now extremely outspoken on the need for Japan to undertake a clear rapprochement with Taiwan. And of course, this put a lot of pressure on the government of Kishida, because Abe, is still central to the functioning of the Liberal Democratic Party. He's the head of the biggest faction. And therefore, that's why we have a lot of interesting debate in Japan today. Some people are asking for a Japanese version of the Taiwan Relations Act, for example. Some other people are actually thinking about, are having similar debate as the one happening in Washington about whether we should abandon strategic ambiguity for strategic clarity. Because Japan also maintains a certain strategic ambiguity vis-à-vis Taiwan. So you have this similar debate.
So from here, Lionel, what can we expect from the National Defense Program guidelines and to be issued alongside the National Security Strategy of Japan?
Yes, so these National Defense Program guidelines will be extremely important because, as I said before, this is really here that in line with the national defense, the national security strategy, the Japanese military plan for defense posture, and if you want, try to determine the level of forces it needs to maintain or to acquire to fulfill the objective of the strategy. I think we will see a progress towards cross-domain operations, meaning again the ability of the military to operate across different domains of warfare, meaning sea, air, ground, and etc., going beyond cyberspace, space, new technologies. I think we will see also a lot of focus on hypersonic technologies, quantum computing, because clearly with these National Defense Program guidelines, I think Japan will want to actually set the basis for the development of the new technologies that will define warfare in the decades ahead. So I think artificial intelligence, quantum computing will be extremely important to emphasize. Also, I think where maybe the innovation will be located mainly will be in the structure of the self-defense forces. We have seen over the past few years the emergence of units or groups in different domains of warfare. So typically, we have had the Space Domain Mission Unit, then the Space Operations Group. We have had the Cyber Defense Group, Cyber Defense Command, Electronic Operations Unit. Well, they are still at the level, if you want, of group command units. They are small. This is the beginning of something. Let's see whether the National Defense Program guidelines will push them at a higher level of institutionalization. And again, because I guess these defense guidelines will put a lot of emphasis on cross-domain operation, let's see whether you will not have a certain merging to, again, prevent the silos that have weakened the self-defense forces for decades before the trend towards greater jointness undertaken 15 years ago, somehow. So let's see how the structure will evolve, and I think it is here that the main innovation can come from. And here, one of the models for that, I think, will be the American concept of integrated deterrence. We talk a lot about that today. Integration across domain of warfare, across the spectrum of conflict. And I think also as the concept is refined in the United States, it will feed the Japanese debate for the program guidelines that will be issued alongside the security strategy.
I asked one question about the unknown aspects of the national security. Let me ask again about the unknown aspect related to the national defense program guidelines.
Yes, well, one key unknown. Again, here I have an excuse because I'm blocked in Switzerland. I cannot travel to Japan to have insights. Okay, something maybe somebody in the audience knows, but I don't know, is whether we will move or we will go beyond the concept that was enshrined in the 2018 guidelines, the concept of multi-domain defense force. Whether we will have a new concept, multi and I don't know, Maybe we will have a new concept. I have no idea. So here, this is my real unknown regarding the guidelines. Another unknown could be also reflected in the strategy, but I think rather in the guidelines, will be whether we will have an allusion to nuclear submarines. I mean, AUKUS, the pact we all know between the UK, the US, and Australia, has somehow opened the Pandora's box, not in a negative sense, it's just an image. I mean, this is the first time since 1958 that the United States agrees to share nuclear naval propulsion technology. In 1958, it shared with the UK, and now it is sharing with Australia. We know that many countries are now extremely interested and are reaching out to Washington saying, well, you agreed to provide the technology to Australia, we want it. One of the key candidates pushing hard is South Korea. And I mean, if it makes sense somehow, this technology for South Korea to ask for this technology, it makes even more sense for Japan. Japan is somehow a submarine country. It has had, even during the Cold War, the duty to close and to monitor the straits, typically. It's extremely effective to have nuclear submarines, can stay on the water for a very long time, pretty silent, and etc. So let's see whether in the guidelines an allusion to the nuclear propulsion will emerge. Even though everything that is nuclear is basically sensitive in Japan, we may see something. Finally, the real unknown, and what we have to look at is strike capabilities. So you have this debate for decades in Japan, but it has become more concrete recently about whether Japan should acquire the ability to strike the territory of other countries. This is a key unknown.
So when you're talking about the strike capabilities, let me ask about what is the state of the debate on the strike capabilities, because I think Japan currently has a restraint about the strike capabilities. What will be your explanation on this capability?
Yes, this is a very sensitive debate because, as you said, it has constraints, meaning that Japan still today is supposed to maintain an exclusively defense-oriented defense posture. Now, the point is, I mean, the debate is more and more, I would say, productive, but it's still far from being mature from my point of view. Because I think, from what I understood, Japanese security officials have not answered a key question. First, why do they want strike capabilities? Because you have here two candidates. Either you want to bolster deterrence against North Korea, having what is called an offensive deterrence. But is it because of China? Because now the argument is emerging that actually strike capabilities is not only effective to maybe have a counter strike or preemptive strike against North Korea, but also to help the United States closing the missile gap with China. Because as you know, until recently, until Donald Trump withdrew from the INF treaty back in 2019, the United States was prevented from developing intermediate range ballistic missiles. And therefore, this is an area where Japan has actually a huge advantage. And therefore, some in Japan are starting to say, well, we have to somehow develop our own strike capabilities so that it fits the alliance need to be stronger in this domain. So first, I think the Japanese leaders have to make sure what are these strike capabilities acquired for. Then, if, for example, you say, well, it's for North Korea. North Korea was the first justification for these strike capabilities. Now, how do you use them? I mean, some people, and I guess this is a minority today, were first saying, well, strike capabilities will be used to preempt on North Korea, meaning North Korea is loading, fueling its missile. The missiles are on the launch pad. Before the missiles are fired, we destroy them. And the reasoning here is that because North Korean missiles are more and more sophisticated, sophisticated and that not all may be intercepted by Japanese missile defense system, we have to preempt. What I mean, it's, from my point of view, it's completely unrealistic, to be honest. I mean, especially with a country that makes so many missile tests. How do you know the intention of North Korea having a missile on a launch pad? Is it another exercise? I mean, you have a problem here. The intelligence should be extremely precise to understand that this missile is actually aimed, if fired, at Japanese territory. And therefore, I guess, because the debate becomes more mature and therefore more realistic, the option is more about counter-strike, also called enemy-based strike in Japan, which will be, and this is here that you have the rationalization as a defensive instrument, meaning that the strike capabilities will not be used actually to preempt. It will be that, for example, North Korea launches missiles toward Japan. Interception of most of them, hopefully all of them, by missile defense system of Japan. But then Japan will be able to counterattack to prevent a second wave of missile coming from North Korea. So that will be the rationalization which arguably could fit the exclusively defensive defense posture of Japan. But now the point is, if these strike capabilities are expected to also close the missile gap with China, well, how to use them and how do they fit with the American, in the alliance, the context of the alliance with the Americans? Where to position them? If these are ground strike capabilities, meaning those who are put on land, the ideal candidate is clearly Okinawa. Well, try to tell Okinawan people, which have basically, with their 60% of the American troops positioned in Japan are in Okinawa. And you tell them tomorrow, well, see, these missiles will be put on your territory and they are quite likely to be the first that China will strike in case of war. I mean, you have here a problem of sustainability for Japan. Now, of course, one of the possibility for Japan to avoid this problem of sustainability, local sustainability, would be to have ship-based strike capabilities. Some people talk about acquiring Tomahawks, because the Tomahawks can be actually launched from the with a few modification of the Aegis system that are on the destroyers of Japan that are used for missile defense. So it's possible. But it requires a lot of deep thinking, because then, and to finish with that, if Japan really acquires strike capabilities, you will need to have an in-depth revision of the alliance structure with the United States. This alliance structure, since the treaty between the two countries, and the second one, the revised one in 1960, has been based on the spear and shield structure. The shield is Japan. The Japanese forces protect Japan and US troops based in Japan. The United States use bases in Japan to project power in the region. Well, if Japan acquires strike capabilities, it now has a spear tool. And therefore, the spear and shield alliance structure, well, I mean, lose sense. This will be a spear and spear alliance structure. So you will have a restructuration of the alliance that will be necessary. And that's why the consequences of Japanese acquiring strike capabilities goes much beyond the potential, well, the almost certain negative reactions by countries like China. It also implies a huge consequences for the relationship with the United States, that's for sure.
From here, Lionel, let me ask my last questions to you. What are the main challenges for Japan is facing and adapting to rapidly evolving regional security environment in East China Sea, in South China Sea, and the whole of Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, the first, and it's the tragedy of Japan, or the sin of Japan, is its own political instability. Again, like in between the Koizumi era and the Abe era, this period of instability during which Japanese security establishment was paralyzed. okay, could not actually, was not flexible enough to adapt the rapidly changing regional environment, because all the politicians and the key decision makers were focused on domestic struggles, political issues, backstage, political negotiation, etc. So, I mean, one of the potential weakness of Japan, or challenge, is that we go back to a period of political instability. I mean, Abe retired as prime minister now one and a half year ago. Well, Suga, the person who replaced him, lasted 1 year in office. Then now we have Kishida. Well, some people are already saying, well, we will go back to this cycle that is a hell cycle with one prime minister per year. I'm not saying it will happen. But I mean, there is this possibility that actually we are all entering another era of political instability of Japan that will again paralyze the ability to adapt to a regional environment that is evolving extremely rapidly. And second, the second challenge, which is more structural, I would say, well, it's that Japan has limited capabilities, limited capacities in many regards. Financially, I mean, we have this debate on the defense budget of Japan today. So Kishida and others have promoted the idea of raising the defense budget of Japan to 2% of the GDP. Well, even with that, Japan will struggle facing a rapidly growing China, a growingly sophisticated North Korea, and etc. So yes, more defense budget, good. But I mean, Japan is a country that, economically speaking, is stagnating for 30 years. And therefore, you will need to have a new way to approach, I would say, defense budget and the streamlining of typically military assets procurement. And finally, demographic dynamics. That's maybe the Achilles heel of the Japanese military. Japan is a super aged society. Much more than Germany, more than Italy, than Greece. Japan is old. And the self-defense forces are struggling to attract young people. And we are not in the world of Terminator yet. I mean, a military without human power doesn't work. So you need people. And therefore, I know the self-defense forces are making a lot of efforts to attract young people. They are doing anime, mangas, blah, 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 okay, trying to make it nice to be in the military. I'm not sure it will work. So the point is, the biggest challenge I see for Japan now, given its limited resources, is to have a list of priorities, what it wants to achieve. Given its capacities, Japan will not be able to face Russia, North Korea, and China. Even with the help of the United States, Japan has to prioritize now. Let me just give you an example to finish. The relationship with North Korea. I mean, I'm struggling to understand the rationale of Japan continuing to try to upgrade its missile defense system, which is extremely costly, while actually we are in a period of offense dominance when it comes to missile technology. I mean, North Korea is a country that, economically speaking, is extremely weak. Still, it is developing hypersonic technologies. Clearly, it's far from perfect, but they are developing. I mean, what I mean is that $1 spent for North Korea to develop hypersonic missiles will require for Japan, $1,000 in missile defense. I mean, you have here to have a real debate on how to tackle the issue, because Japan is spending a lot of money for countering North Korea. I don't want to stigmatize North Korea, but North Korea is nothing, economically speaking and military speaking. And therefore, I mean, maybe Japan, and this is an idea I launched like this, but maybe Japan should slightly abandon this myth of absolute security. I mean, missile defense system, yes, I understand the political rationale of a politician trying to reassure the population. Yes, we have PAC-3 in the center of Tokyo, we will defend, intercept North Korean missile. But why not making things more concrete? I mean, invest in civil protection. bunkers, more exercise to help people understand how to shelter. In Switzerland, we have this system. Just before I joined the conversation with you, we had alarm bell training. So all the alarm bells at all schools in Switzerland started to go. Well, because when we have these exercises, we know how to do. This is what the Japanese government should do to minimize damages to the population in case of North Korean attack, instead of spending billions in this missile defense system, which honestly, from my point of view, make less and less sense. In other words, I think Japan really needs here to rethink the basis of its thinking in terms of security policy. I gave the example of North Korea. I think it could also, the similar thinking has to be made for other security threats.
Now, Lionel, there is a question from audiences. Go ahead with them. What kind of breakthroughs will the resumption of ballistic missiles tests of North Korea force Japan to take in the field of defense? Could you read now?
Yeah, I can read. Okay, just trying to understand what breakthrough will. Well, I mean, it will not push any breakthrough when it comes to Japanese defense posture or security policy. I think Japanese leaders are pretty clear in the fact that North Korea is on a trend that is about sophisticating its missile defense system, and therefore this is something that is somehow, I would say, registered in the matrix of security officials in Tokyo. That, of course, the development of hypersonic and gliding vehicles and hypersonic cruise missiles by North Korea is concerning. But unfortunately, contrary to what I said, I think it will not change the thinking of Japanese leaders that it is about missile defense. I hope it will. I hope they will understand that missile defense system is not the key, the golden asset. I think what could really lead Japanese leaders, or can provoke a shock for Japanese leaders to really reorient their policy vis-à-vis North Korea, will be the ultimate test for North Korea, meaning you test both, and at the same time, the missile technology plus the nuclear weapon. In other words, you tip a missile with a nuclear warhead, you send it somewhere in the Pacific, I don't know. Here, maybe this will be something that will push Japanese leaders to really start to think more seriously about the threat from North Korea, and to revise their approach, maybe.
Christina Neumann, is there a possibility that Dokdo Island will return to Japan one day? Or will it remain an eternal chronic problem between the two neighboring countries?
Yes. So I suggest you ask the question to South Korea. No, I mean it's extremely unlikely because I mean it's in the South Korean mind, the Dokdo Island is an inherent part of South Korean territory. And again, for a South Korean government, even a South Korean government that wants to maintain ties with Japan, what can Japan offer in exchange so that the South Korea is ready to give the Dokdo to Japan? Now, I think looking at the nationalistic feeling in the two countries, they are extremely strong, both in South Korea and Japan. I mean, any government that is like South Korea that wants to give or even to make some concessions on this kind of issue that are extremely sensitive, especially when you add to that historical debates and etc. I mean, this is a political suicide for any person in Seoul. And that's why, I mean, back to the Diaoyu Senkaku Island, which is a similar situation, just the opposite, okay, for Japan. I mean, I think in the 70s when, Deng and Japanese government decided to freeze the issues, shelved it, saying, well, let's don't talk about that. This is the honeymoon. We normalize our relationship. We are more or less on the same side of the Cold War. But I mean, that's the only way to actually calm down the dispute. It starts with actually politicians stopping to politicize that. And of course, when you have the highest police official in South Korea visiting the islands, that's not a good way to calm down the situation. These islands, if you want, from my point of view, should be neutralized in the sense politicians in the two countries reach a gentleman agreement, a modus operandi, that is, we stop using the islands as a card in our relationship or even in domestic politics. We forget they are here. South Korea administer them. Japan claims them on paper. We stop here, and we focus on things that are more important for us, bilateral cooperation, and etc. That's the only way I see.
Lionel, do you think it's possible to forget for both countries?
It's not. I mean, it's possible. It's possible to forget that these islands are a problem between the two countries. Of course, people will say, well, but the populations in the two countries are really attached to territorial sovereignty, etc. Yes or no? It depends on the leaders. It depends on the message they convey. Honestly, I mean, I am in Europe. In the north of Switzerland, you have Germany and France. Never forget what they did. Okay, they fought during centuries. They hated each other during centuries. Much longer than Japan and South Korea. At some point, because they had a common enemy or common interest, they decided to say, well, Alsace-Lorraine, we forget about that. War reparation, we forget about that. And you can go above. It takes time, and it takes especially political will. The big problem today, being in Seoul and Tokyo, is that in Seoul, the anti-Japanese narrative works pretty well. In Tokyo, the other way around. So as long as it doesn't change, in other words, as long as these two countries are not pushed together by a common cause, meaning this will not be the United States because the United States has failed, meaning, for example, China becoming extremely aggressive against both at the same time, or North Korea doing something that is that will merge them together. But political will be difficult, but I mean that's the only way forward.
Because in East Asia, the matter of island disputes is a serious matter, I think, and to one extent depend to the leaders of the countries also depend on the vote of the people, especially during the elections.
Yes, of course, and I mean here I don't want to do Japan bashing, but be aware that Japan has territorial disputes with all its neighbors. With Russia, with China, with South Korea, with North Korea, because North Korea claims the same territory as China, and because Taiwan claims also the same territory as China, with Taiwan. I mean, I understand the argument that during the Cold War, we know these disputes were frozen because of the division of the region, but still. I mean, you have here to show one leader one day in Japan will have to show proactivity in saying, well, I mean, this is problematic to have these continuous territorial disputes everywhere. I'm not saying this is only the fault of Japanese leaders. I'm saying that there are solutions. There are solutions, and more energy should be dedicated to that. With China will be extremely problematic because China is growing stronger and more confident. But with certain countries, with South Korea also, there are solutions to find. And nothing prevents also countries and academicians, and this is here that the certain track which are more informal could be interesting. But you have also, it's not always black and white. You have innovative solutions to find when you have this kind of disputes. Okay, in regarding the northern territories, southern Korea between Japan and Russia, you had this solution that has now been abandoned or put aside because of the tensions between Russia and the West. But having Russia gives back 2 islands to Japan. Russia keeps 2 of them, but the people will be extended a special regime in terms of visa and economic activities so that people from Hokkaido can go to the 2 islands still belonging to Russia to visit because they have their ancestors buried there. I mean, you have this plus solution It's not always black and white. This is mine. This is yours. And I think here, I mean, leaders in the region should be much more innovative. Looking at other regions, because other countries have done a lot of good work in certain instances, they should get inspired from my point of view.
Okay, let me. Lucas Carlson, what will be the attitude of Japan in a possible military intervention of PRC against Taiwan?
The huge question mark. So the point, two things. First, it will depend on the nature of the military intervention of China. In Japan today, clearly there is an obvious realization that a war in the Taiwan Strait is possible. Okay, maybe not likely, but possible. What is extremely concerning for Japan is a lower intensity conflict. And I think I will tend to agree with this argument, is that for China, invading Taiwan, quote unquote, is still extremely costly, both militarily speaking, but also in terms of reputation, to be honest. And domestic politics, I mean, you have also to justify that you, Chinese people, will be killing Chinese people. You can always justify the fact that you topple down the government in Taiwan because they are nationalists and breakaway politicians, rightists. But I mean, even in the Chinese Communist Party propaganda, the people in Taiwan, the population are still brothers and sisters. So you have also to justify that. What is more likely is that looking at the pattern of the air exercises of the Japanese Air Forces will be a military intervention that will be directed towards the Dongsha Islands, also called Pratas Islands, which are easy to seize, militarily speaking. And the objective here will be, I think, to test the response of both Japan and the United States. And because this is a low intensity conflict, this is to see whether Japan and the United States, how they will react. So diplomatic condemnations, of course, whether there will be economic sanctions, and how they will maybe move militarily speaking. I'm quite sure that in these kind of circumstances, the US and Japan will not fight frontally China, but there will be military maneuvers to try to show China, you did a bad thing, don't go beyond that. Okay, and the point is that we know Japan and the United States are working more and more on operational plans in case of Taiwanese contingencies. They have to work on that, on this low intensity provocation by China. Now, if China attacks, or if they war, let's say I do not take position on who will attack who is the culprit. There is a war in the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and China. Well, I guess the Japanese position will depend largely on the reaction of the United States. Of course, Japan, by definition, will deploy troops to protect its own territory, meaning it will put troops in the Ryukyu Arc, meaning Okinawa, if you know.
First island.
Yes, it's part of the first island chain. We put the troops on alert, missile defense, and etc., etc. Now, whether it moves beyond, let's see, because this can evolve. But as far as I know, the plan, if the United States intervene, one of the key roles of Japan would be to make sure that American troops, reinforcements, meaning especially carrier strike groups, coming from either Yokosuka, southwest of Tokyo, or Guam, Hawaii, San Diego, has a free passage to striking positions near China. And therefore, the objective will be to make sure they control the straits to prevent Chinese warships and especially submarines from going out in the West Pacific. So they will control that.
Okay? It means that will block the Miyako Strait also?
Yes, of course. But even during the Cold War, it was the case. And by the way, Japan trained this way of warfare northeast during the Cold War, because you have the Sea of Okhotsk, where the Soviet nuclear submarines were basically positioned. Okay, and one of the objectives of Japan, the self-defense forces during the Cold War, was that in case of war, the submarines of the Soviet Union will not be able to jump out of the sea. It is the same with the straits around Miyako Straits and the others. So, but again, it will depend on what the United States does. Not sure the United States will come to the help of Taiwan. At least I think they will, but there is no certainty because so far, again, in Washington, it's still strategic ambiguity. So let's see how it develops. Now, just a last point on that, we have seen emerging information that in case of contingency, one of the plans between Japan and the United States is about creating a temporary bases, logistical bases for American troops in Okinawa. In other words, small bases, flexible, that can be relocated rapidly, so that they act as, if you want, a logistical hub for American troops to come from the Pacific, stop in Japan, and then jump towards China. Flexible, temporary, because we know, and Japanese know very well, if Japan is involved alongside the United States in a war against China in the Taiwan Strait, well, one of the first targets for China will be the American troops and Japanese troops in the first island chain. That's for sure. And therefore, this is why this logistical basis will be mobile and etc. to actually prevent being erased from the map before they become operative.
Lionel, I hope you bring your coffee. I think my audiences find this conversation is very funny, and therefore the questions are
Good.
flowing.
I'm happy to hear it. I can stay another 10 minutes maybe. Okay.
Okay, just shortly, maybe you can. There is, I think, 4 questions. Ingvin, what are the roles of space and cybersecurity in Japan's national security strategy to counter the growing threat in Northeast Asia?
Okay, so the question will be for the forthcoming national security strategy, I guess. Well, or what is today? Okay. Well, in terms of space, it's basically intelligence. Okay. I mean, to intercept a missile, you have to see the missile. It's as simple as that. So you need to make sure you detect the missile and then the launch of the missile, and then be able to track the trajectory of the missile to actually, with kinetic energy, be able to intercept it before it reaches your territory. It's as simple as that. Well, it seems to be simple. The point is, again, because North Korea is developing low altitude missiles, it becomes extremely complicated with, I would say, traditional satellites to track the missiles, especially when they fly at hypersonic speed. And that's why I mentioned these small satellite constellations. So to track these missiles that go extremely rapidly and at low altitude, you have to have, instead of having 1 or 2 satellites positioned high in orbit, you have a series of satellites that are at low orbit. And they are able to track the missile at different, the speed to track the missiles, and they communicate to each other to have a line of the trajectory. And this is on what the United States and Japan are working jointly today. So this is key to actually, again, missile defense. Okay, so that's the space, the main space dimension for the security of Japan when it comes to North Korea. Regarding cyber defense, well, as I say, then that's my point of view. I'm not saying I hold the truth. I will never say that, but I think North Korea is extremely dangerous in the cyberspace, much more than in the physical space. And therefore, for Japan, the national security strategy, one of the objectives will be, well, to prevent, again, attack that will be about stealing, state secrets, to steal, because maybe one day Japan will enter some negotiations, so important to somehow close the doors to what's happening inside the government. But everything that is a bit about sensitive technologies. Japan is producing a lot of technologies that are dual use, are used for the civilian activities, but also can be used for military programs. And I mean, I don't know, but looking at the technological development of North Korea in recent years in terms of missile technology, I'm quite wondering whether it has not been able to hack certain programs in certain countries, being in China, in Russia, in the United States, or elsewhere. Because I'm not here saying that North Korea is a country of the Middle Ages, but I mean, in terms of scientific basis, North Korea seems to be more advanced today in terms of hypersonic missiles than the United States. If you look at the track of hypersonic tests in the United States in recent months and years, this is failure after failure. North Korea seems at least at the same level. There is something that doesn't match here. So Japan has to protect itself also in terms of these technologies. And finally, as I said, a cyber attack on critical infrastructures of Japan, given the demographic and urban setting of this country, would be devastating. Economically devastating. I mean, again, Japan is in economic stagnation for 30 years. You just paralyze Tokyo and the Kanto area for one day. You will see. I mean, the economy, you will lose, I don't know how many, 0.5, 1%, 2% point of GDP at the end of the year because of that. And therefore, again, this is one attack. So North Korea, if it wants to be aggressive and be coercive, can launch regular attacks. Saying Japan, well, now you pay, or now you do something, I don't know. But here it's key for Japan. I think this is the biggest threat from North Korea is cyber attack.
I see. Let me bring this one. Tanzan, what does Lionel think about the Russian weapons and defense systems deployments concentrated around the Kuril Islands in recent years? Yes, this is about North.
That's a good question. Very good. That was a good fait accompli. So as you know, as you remember, Shinzo Abe and Vladimir Putin are maybe the two leaders that met the most often during the 2010s. I don't remember how many times they met, but more than 30 times. Okay, in about like 7 years. Shinzo Abe was eager and extremely eager to actually solve this issue, this territorial dispute, and reach a peace treaty. So we closed the chapter of the Pacific War. We have a peace treaty, and etc. Now it didn't really went well, and one of the reasons for that is that Japan still maintains sanctions on Russia, economic sanctions, because of the 2014 intervention in Ukraine. So Putin said, well, we can progress in the negotiations, but withdraw the sanctions. But Japan will, of course, try to see whether the United States will be eager for Japan to loosen sanctions on Russia, and the United States will, of course, say no. And Japan is blocked between the two. And therefore, at some point, I guess, Russia decided, well, we militarize the islands, two of the islands only, okay, with anti-ship missiles, especially, and air defense, but especially anti-ship missiles, to make sure, well, now Japan understands this is our. Never claim again the 4 islands, these 2 at least, they are our. And also, there is also something, it was a message to Japan, meaning be more serious about the negotiations, listen less to Washington, and it was also a message to the United States. Because when Russia became extremely serious in militarizing this island is when, after the United States started withdrew, well, was about to withdraw from the INF. Russia is extremely afraid that the United States will ask Japan to put medium-range missile in Hokkaido, so near Russian territory. And therefore, Russia wants to Tokyo and Washington to make sure don't do that, because otherwise I will even more militarize the island. In other words, Putin and his establishment, they are very wise in putting a Damocles sword in the head of Tokyo, making sure they understand, if you accept American medium-range missile on your territory, first, you will never recover the islands. You can be sure of that. And second, you will have an arms race in the northeast of your country. Because I already have the foundations, I already put missiles. If the Americans put their missiles, I will actually increase my missiles much higher. So this was a nice move, I would say, in a real political point of view.
I bring this one, and then told me if you have time.
The last one maybe, okay?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I have to leave.
In recent years, the balance between strike and defense has become increasingly advantageous for Japan's adversaries. Is there a regulation regarding Japan's restrictive defense policy on this issue?
So the balance between strike and defense has become increasingly advantageous for Japan. Yeah. No. Well, I mean, again, Japan according to the current interpretation of its Article 9 and regarding relevant security documents, Japan is not supposed to have what the Article 9 of the definition define as war capabilities. War capabilities is include, according to the interpretation we have today of the Constitution, include offensive capabilities. Those who could be used to either invade other countries or attack other countries. Okay, so again, but the point is, again, the devil is in the details in Japan, especially when it comes to interpretation of laws, including the supreme law. I mean, you can clearly justify strike capabilities in Japan if you surround strike capabilities with a concept that is, well, we will use them only as a counter strike. So we are attack, we counter. And this is still defensive. The only point is that deterrence here will not be defensive only, will be also an offensive deterrence, meaning that you have not only, I would say, a deterrence by denial in which you make sense, you make sure that you absorb the shock with missile defense and etc., but certain teeth, meaning deterrence by punishment, by saying, if you attack me, so be it, but make sure that I will make you pay the cost. So this can be rationalized in view of the legal structure of Japan today. But now the point, and I will maybe finish with that because I have to leave. If you go down the thinking, and I'm not saying it will happen, but theoretically, if you go down the thinking, at the end of the reasoning, you have nuclear weapons. Why? Because let's imagine you have the thinking vis-a-vis China. So my objective is to have a deterrence that is offensive, meaning I will never start the fighting with China. If they fire a missile at me, I will only make them pay for what they did. So if they attack, let's say, Osaka, I will strike on Taiwan. Good. Now, China is a nuclear power. Like North Korea is a nuclear power. So it applies also to North Korea. But I mean, if you do that, you enter the issue of crisis escalation. So who will be the one with the biggest chips on the table? The biggest amount of chips? Well, with nuclear power, these are nuclear powers. Meaning that if China fires, Japan will have to say, well, if you fire, I fire on Shanghai. But China will say, if you fire on Shanghai, I will fire on another city and I will threaten you with nuclear bomb. It's this crisis escalation. In other words, there is an argument by, I would say, left-wing politicians in Japan, but that somehow makes sense theoretically, is that strike capabilities, the end product, if this is to be used as counter strike, the end product is the possession by Japan of a nuclear bomb, because the region is nuclearized, right? And theoretically speaking, they are correct. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that Japan will have a nuclear bomb. I clearly think this is out of the debate today, and for the years to come it will be. But still, this is something you have to keep in mind, because you opened a door. A few decades later, the door can actually be wide open to something, depending on the evolution of the regional system, of course. Yeah, I will have to leave, Lokman. I'm so sorry.
No problem. Thank you very much. Also, today you tell us about the most important country in the region and its national security strategy. And now almost 1 hour and a half talking about us. Thank you very much, Lionel. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting Lokman, and please continue this beautiful podcast series. It's informing for all of us. So please, good job.
Thank you very much, Lionel, and also
bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Take care.
Take care. Thank you. Yes, dear friends, unfortunately, we don't have enough time. My guest has another appointment, I think. I hope in upcoming shows you can submit your question and find answers. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and share with your networks, with your friends. As you know, we are doing a live stream with the expert about Asia and Pacific affairs on my channel. Share the link of video and subscribe to channel, and don't forget to like the videos. And thank you very much for being with me until the end of shows. See you in the upcoming shows.